Right about now, live with Rob Fyfe, former CEO of Air New Zealand. G'day, Rob.
Yeah, g'day, Pat. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. I was just thinking, actually. I mean, you left Air New Zealand in 2012. Is it still cool to introduce you as former CEO of Air New Zealand? Is it weird having something nearly a decade old sort of be one of your main identifying attributes right now?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I was down in Hawke's Bay in February for Elton John concert,
Right.
and I was walking through the kind of the crowds at Mission Vineyard, and this woman comes up to me and said, "Are you Rob Fyfe?" And I was kind of had a hat on, and I was in like concert gears, right? So I'd look nothing like my former CEO self. And anyway, I said, yes. She said, CEO of Air New Zealand. I said, well, I haven't been for 8 years.
Yeah.
And she said, well, never mind. I've got a complaint I want to share with you, right? So 8 years after the fact, and I still couldn't avoid the Air New Zealand complaint. So there you go.
Are you do you have a fly Jetstar, or are you always on Air New Zealand because of the history?
No, I tell you, I even when I was at Air New Zealand, once a quarter, I would religiously fly on another airline.
Right.
I always wanted to see what was going on, competition. Yeah. Likewise, I often flew down the back of the aircraft. You have much different conversations if you're flying in economy than you do in business class, because you're a little bit closer together. It's a bit more intimate.
Yep.
I fly Air New Zealand obviously when I can. I feel tremendous loyalty to the old firm, but these days I travel a lot. Well, I was traveling a lot, and you kind of jump on whoever's going to get you to the right place.
Gosh, I mean, like, you are former CEO now, but that must be one of the most surreal experiences ever to see a current CEO of Air New Zealand on like a Jetstar flight or a Qantas flight or something. That people must double take when that happened. It'd be like someone, I don't know, whoever the person is who runs Coke. Imagine them being seen out in public drinking Pepsi, sort of thing.
Well, I'll tell you another very funny story. So I'm one of the things I used to do when I was at Air New Zealand is once a month I'd go and work somewhere in the business, right, just for a day on a shift. So I could, I might cleaning toilets, or I'm working on the hangar, or I go out with the crew and serve tea and coffee on the aircraft. And quite often, if I was flying somewhere, I'd serve tea and coffee. Anyway, I was on Qantas one day flying from Wellington to Canberra, because Air New Zealand didn't fly on that route, and I need to get to Canberra. And I jump on the plane, and the crew, the Qantas crew, they were a New Zealand-based crew, and they instantly recognised who I was. And anyway, one thing led to another, and I said, quite often when I'm on the Air New Zealand flights, I help them out with the tea and coffee. And they said, well, you can help us out with the tea and coffee if you want. So I get up, and there I am serving tea and coffee on this Qantas flight going to Canberra with these crew. And there are obviously quite a few New Zealanders on the flight. So people started taking pictures, right? Because as you say, they thought this is a slightly odd situation.
Yeah.
Then the crew started getting nervous that they were going to get themselves in a bit of strife if any of these pictures ever made it kind of back to their bosses. So I got banished back to my seat and told that I couldn't do it anymore. So
I mean, just think about
it was a funny time.
Think about less than a decade onwards. Not only would those pictures have got out, they probably would have got out live from the plane's Wi-Fi whilst you were still across the Tasman to Facebook, Twitter, and whatever else they want to be. Before you landed, there would have been people probably waiting to talk to you about it.
Tell me about it, right? But I tell you, even before Wi-Fi, so you go back then, I took over as CEO of Air New Zealand in 2005. Even back then, if I got on a plane and started chatting with the crew down the back in the galley, I'd always go and have a natter to the crew. By the time that flight landed in somewhere like LA,
yeah,
the whole entire crew population somehow knew about everything you've been talking about down in the galley. So they had their ways and means even back in those days. But,
so what you're saying is basically social media is just the latest version of the grapevine, but it's always been around.
it's always been around. It's definitely more instantaneous than it was, but yeah, no, it's always been around for sure.
I was wondering, I was working in Talkback at the time that you were CEO, and you left at the end of 2012. 2012, is that right? Is that your last year?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think it was 2013-ish that the national government then sold off some shares in our state-owned assets, including about another 25%-ish of Air New Zealand. I mean, completely random question, but did that have anything to do with it? Was that something you weren't supportive of, or?
No. I was a big supporter, actually. The less involvement the government has in the airline, I think the better for the airline is my personal view. And we've been lobbying for quite some time for the government to sell down its stake, because one of the reasons other investors didn't want to invest in the airline is there wasn't enough of what's referred to as liquidity. So, you could buy a few million shares in Air New Zealand, but there were so few shares trading on any one day that a lot of the big institutions and so on didn't want to take a stake in the airline, because they said, if we ever wanted to get out, we wouldn't be able to sell down quick enough because there's so few shares trading. And the main reason for that is because the government owns 70-odd% of the airline. So by selling down shares, then they actually kind of created more incentive for other people to invest in the airline, and that's exactly what's happened since they did that.
So more shares on the market, literal more individual shares on the market, mean bigger companies can get a bigger stake, which makes it more attractive.
Correct.
Yeah, right.
Correct. And so what that meant is you saw a number of institutional investors and mutual funds and so on start to invest in the airline where they weren't prepared to do that before, and that was good for the share price. So it meant there was more demand for the shares, and that increased the share price, but it also diversified the shareholding base for the airline. That's a good thing for the airline as well.
I was wondering when the coronavirus lockdown hit, and all of a sudden it was like straight. I was about to say it was like 9/11. I don't like that kind of tragedy, but the airs were empty. The flights stopped all over the world like it did around 9/11. And obviously some airlines around the world struggled a lot through that. But we being Air New Zealand, it feels like we all own it. Well, we do, I guess, in part. 51% owned by the government. I was thinking, how does that work for an investor? It must be a goldmine for an investor, because if the government owns 51%, they'll never let it go bankrupt, which means the investors, the private investors of the other 49-ish%, whatever it is, it must be like a sweet deal as an investor. I don't own any shares, so I'm a little bit naive to this, but if you've got a country backing an airline to not let it fall over, it must be a pretty solid investment for the private investors owning the other 47, 48, 49%, because it's never going to go under.
Well, it's never going to go under, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the value of your equity will be protected.
Right.
So, if you go back to following the Ansett collapse, the government bailed out the airline. They invested $800 million in the airline. So this is back in early 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, basically all the shareholders that owned shares in the airline at that stage, all their equity pretty much got diluted away to nothing. So although they had shares in the airline, their shares were worth nothing, because in exchange for their 800 million, the government got 80 or 90% of the airline. So it gives you a degree of confidence the airline won't fail. And Air New Zealand has a very high credit rating, a very good credit rating, because people perceive the government stands behind it. But that doesn't necessarily protect the value of your investment.
I was thinking about this with, I had a couple of politicians on during lockdown, and we had little chats around how we as a country can get our economy back post-COVID, which might take, who knows, a decade to get back, but whatever. And we were coming up with little slogans for tourism, like, can't do Queensland, do Queenstown. Can't do France, do Whakatane, that sort of thing. And it was this idea of us being loyal to New Zealand, putting our dollars into New Zealand and into things like Air New Zealand, but also looking for loyalty back again. In other words, in New Zealand as an example, if they could charge $200 for a ticket between Auckland and Wellington, but that like break even mark was $100, maybe they charge 150. So everyone sort of wins and encourages people to get out the door and encourages money to go out the country. I'm wondering, with something that's half owned by the government, by us, where is the line between private entity and state asset that's really set up as a good for the country? Like the making profits versus providing a service. How do you kind of dance that line with something that's owned mostly by the government?
Well, in this, I've got a really clear view on this. You have to run the airline on a fully commercial basis. So, when I was CEO, you want to run the airline to say, right, we want to deliver great outcomes for our customers.
Yep.
Because that's what will motivate them to come back and fly with us again. That in turn should deliver great outcomes for your shareholders, and you'll never deliver great outcomes for your customers unless you have your employees on board and really engaged and wanting to deliver. Because ultimately, the airline business isn't about planes, right? It's all about people. If you have a good or bad flight experience, assuming the plane actually gets there, which fortunately 99.99% of the time it does, then if you have a good or bad experience, it's about something someone did to you that was really good or really bad, right? So as a leader of that organisation, you're wanting to give people the tools, the training, the motivation to create great experiences for your customers. If for some reason, the government wants Air New Zealand to fly to Whakatane, and it doesn't make sense for the airline economically to fly to Whakatane, then that's a choice the government has if it wants to pay the airline or subsidise the airline to fly there because it's a social service or whatever.
Right. Then
the government should make that decision, but it should make that decision independently of owning the airline as a shareholder. Because as a company, you actually have to do what's in the best interest of all your shareholders, not just one, even if they happen to be the majority shareholder. So, by way of example, Air New Zealand, when I was there, would be subsidised to fly to the Cook Islands. We couldn't make money out of flying to the Cook Islands. But the Cook Islands government, no doubt with New Zealand aid money and Australian aid money, would subsidise the airline to fly there because tourism was so important to the islands.
Right.
And I think that's exactly how the model should work.
And when you say it should happen outside the kind of commercial entity of the airline, that implies any airline could fly that route and potentially get that subsidy. Just because Air New Zealand happened to get it, it doesn't matter that they're in New Zealand. It's because it's sort of separate to the commercial entity of the airline.
Correct. And then the government can potentially tender out that opportunity and say, right, we want someone to fly to use Whakatane as an example, who's prepared to do it for the least amount of subsidy, and you can create a competitive tension out there. That, to my mind, is a much more... Everyone then knows which lane they're swimming in, right? If you try and say to me as CEO, well, we want you to make a profit, we want you to pay a dividend, we want you to look after all the other shareholders, and we want you to do this kind of social good flying, then it all becomes a bit confused, and you can never really measure whether anyone's doing the best job they can do, right? It's just a mismatch of objectives.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's almost like you run it and there's almost like a charity wing of the airline. Not that it is that, but I see what you're saying by separate to the commercial sort of plan. And I guess as long as Air New Zealand can decline that, is that a possibility that even though the government's asking it, Air New Zealand, you as the CEO could go, no thanks, we're not interested in that? Or is that more of a grey area?
In a commercial level, well, when I was there, the government was very comfortable that the shareholding relationship was at arm's length. So we made some very tough decisions. When you think when I took over as CEO, we had a Helen Clark-led Labor government in power. I think we had somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 redundancies in my first 2 years in the role. I mean, there's a lot of change going on. We really had to modernise the airline. And the Labor, we had protest marches. It was a very difficult time for the airline. Very important changes, but very difficult. And the Labor government and Helen Clark stood right back from that and said, the airline needs to do what's right for the airline. And they were quite unambiguous about that. And so that decision, or those decisions, just like decisions of which routes we fly, the government wasn't trying to twist our arm to say, you can't go through that redundancy program or whatever. But ultimately, coming back to the route question, if you're running the airline on a commercial basis, there'll always, you decide whether to fly a route or not fly a route. There'll always be a price, right, at which it will make sense to do it.
Yeah.
So it just comes down to a negotiation between how valuable is that to the government in a national interest sense versus, what's it take to incentivise the airline to reallocate capacity to that particular route.
Let me ask you a question. I'm sorry to be talking about Air New Zealand for the first start of this. I kind of didn't really think this was what we wanted to talk about, but I've always, and I have this question asked of me a lot, not that I'm an expert, just kind of in barroom conversations, like from Auckland, why does it usually cost so much less to get to Sydney than it does to get to Queenstown? How does that work?
Yes, so there's kind of two parts of the puzzle. Firstly, if you look at the aircraft that Air New Zealand is flying around, if I want to fly a seat on a really large aircraft, say I'm flying a 777 across the Tasman, for example.
Yep.
And there's a whole range of aircraft flying on those routes, but say I'm flying a 777, the cost to fly each seat a kilometre.
Yep.
Might cost me, let's just use for argument's sake, might cost me, say, 5 cents per kilometre per seat to fly. If I'm flying a seat from Auckland to Nelson on a Q300, a Bombardier 50-seat turboprop, it might cost me 30 cents per kilometre per seat to fly that seat. So you get this much greater economy of scale with a much bigger aircraft. So that's one of the economic drivers. The second thing is that in terms of aircraft efficiency, aircraft use a lot more fuel getting up to altitude and kind of coming back down for altitude than they do in the cruise.
Yep.
So shorter routes are a lot less fuel efficient to fly, and fuel makes up a large proportion of the cost of operating an aircraft. You then have a whole bunch of issues like the economics of kind of airports and all sorts of other things. New Zealand airports typically can be quite expensive to fly in and out of. And then undoubtedly, you get a competitive dimension, which is, if the more competitive a route is, an airline has to chase harder to try and fill their aircraft so they'll accept smaller margins.
Yeah.
So if you look at airlines overall, they typically only make about a 4% profit margin. But, if I look at averages, typically an airline's probably losing money on 20 or 30% of its routes.
Right, wow.
And it might be making 15 to 20% on some routes, and it has to kind of average all of that out. And when I was at Air New Zealand, I certainly remember periods when I joined Air New Zealand, we were losing $1 million a week flying those trans-Tasman routes. So they were the least profitable routes in the network. Why do you fly them? Well, you fly them because the people that come off that route then might jump on say they're coming from Australia to New Zealand, they then might jump on a Auckland Queenstown flight or an Auckland Wellington flight, and you make money on that flight, so you kind of just average the whole thing out.
Right. That's scary. That 4% thing. It's a silly comparison, but it makes me think about when I was a student and I used to work at petrol stations. They said no matter the price of fuel, it was something like a 6% profit margin. So whether it was, now it's $2 a litre, or whether when I was working it was 80, 70 cents a litre. That was about the margin purely for petrol, which is why you saw petrol stations turn into mini supermarkets to actually make some money on top of what they're doing. But that means at 4%, if you're, I'm just picking a number out of the air because I'm thinking 400 seats, etc. If a flight took in $1 million to fly whatever route, like one flight, that was the amount of money that went for tickets. That's only $40,000 of profit if it's completely full for whatever route that is. That's a really small margin.
Well, so I'll give you two stats. When I joined Air New Zealand, we were flying these little 19-seater aircraft around the country. Those little Beech 1900 aircraft, the average profit per flight was $46.
Wow.
It's and you think that's less than one airfare, right?
Yeah.
But if you also put that 4% in context, and you're flying an A320 from Auckland to Wellington, and typically you'd have 150 passengers on board, then the profit margin is 6 passengers, right?
Yeah, right.
So if that aircraft takes off with 144 passengers on board, you only just broke even.
Right.
If it took off with 130 passengers on board, you're losing a truckload of money. So that in itself, the profit margin is ultimately a very, very small number of passengers, which is why, when you're trying to get those aircraft full, you will often offer some very cheap fares, because you're better to have someone sitting in a seat than no one, right?
It makes me think about during this COVID dilemma we're in, when you see, not so much at the moment, but certainly right in that time when we were kind of just starting to go back to flights, you'd see not necessarily repatriation flights, but flights in general with like 2 people on a whole 747-400 coming internationally. I shudder to think, after you've just said that, how much money that would be costing the company itself. I guess for any I mean, I run a small company. That's what this is part of. Obviously, we don't have anywhere near the kind of budgets or numbers, but thinking about taking a hit like that, or a proportional hit like that for any kind of company, would be could be catastrophic in a very short time, which is why I guess you see airlines shutting down through things like 9/11 or like the COVID crisis, because you can't maintain it.
Well, to put it in context, I'm involved. I'm still involved in the industry. I sit on the board of Air Canada today. And to put in context, when we went into COVID, and this is despite standing down, almost 60% of our staff. Mm-hmm. So we started with 38,000 employees. We stood down 21. We're still burning through at the moment, or this is the last figures we announced to the market. We're still burning through $20 million of cash a day.
Wow.
That's what we're spending running the airline. That's our net position, our revenue, less our costs is minus $20 million a day. Over $6 billion a year.
But how does a company even do that? I mean, if the profit margins are so small, I can do economies of scale, right? So I can think about my own little business.
Yeah.
If the profit margins are so slim, so that's how I can compare it. If the profit margins are only 6%, it takes me a long time to build up the capital to then lose, let's say 80% a day for an extended period of time. How does that even? I imagine that just means massive debt, because I can't imagine massive capital being sitting there in a place like Air Canada.
Correct. So, I mean, if you take Air Canada, we went into this in a very strong position. So we had built up a lot of cash. We'd gone into this with about $6 billion of cash sitting on our balance sheet.
Okay.
We've now gone and raised a whole lot of debt. We've raised we've issued some new equity. So that was to get our position up to about $10 billion of cash to try and tide us through this situation. The government has extended and Air Canada's about 3 or 4 times the size of Air New Zealand. Just to put it in context, the New Zealand government's extended a loan to Air New Zealand for $900 million. So you're right. Ultimately, you either have to issue new shares or you've got to get debt. That's the only way, and just try and tide yourself over. But the challenge is trying to figure out how long this is going to go on for, and none of us know the answer to that question at the moment.
Is that 4% profit margin sort of an industry standard? So is it the same sort of at Air Canada? That's what it is, or is New Zealand, because of our isolation, not quite? There's not quite as much fat with us.
So actually, the industry standard is lower than 4%.
Oh wow!
If you take a long run view, so if you took a 10-year view, the industry average profit margin's down around 1.5% or 2%.
Wow.
Air New Zealand typically has been much better than industry average. I mean, it's a very well-run airline. It's recognised around the world as one of the best performing airlines with great product and service. So it has been able to perform better than the average. But realistically, that margin's probably for Air New Zealand has been in the 6 to 8% in more recent times.
Right.
But if you look at, again, as I say, over the last decade, then the average probably ends up around 4%, which is probably double the industry average.
Wow. That's impressive then. So comparatively speaking, we're doing really well. But I obviously that's, I can't even remember the name of it, but, every now and again, some wealthy entrepreneur sticks their head up and goes, I'm going to do a route which is Dunedin, Queenstown, Nelson, Christchurch, Dunedin, like a bus route sort of thing. And they try, I think one was called Kiwi Air from memory. Anyway, recently that's happened, and it doesn't last very long. And that's obviously why, because if there's small profit margins, it's either massive debt or massive success, and there doesn't seem to be any in between ground.
It's on the surface, airlines look like an easy business to get into. You go and lease a plane and off you go. Actually, it's really tough. It's tough because of the profit margins.
Yep.
You need scale. And then ultimately, people are loyal, right? And you need a network. And, you become a member of Air New Zealand's loyalty program, AirPoints, then, if you're flying to LA on Air New Zealand, then you want to fly, to Wellington, you want to fly to Queenstown, you want to accumulate your points so you can spend, and so on and so forth. So if a little airline starts up and they're just flying on 1 or 2 or 3 routes, it's very hard to drag customers away because, as I say, they tend to want to create and build their loyalty with a preferred airline. So it's a very, very tough business to break into.
And I guess it's that I watch those kind of Shark Tank programs and like looking at people talking about business and new invention. And I guess if that little business just start up and it does decide to fly, Queenstown, Nelson, if that becomes commercially successful, then someone like Jetstar or Air New Zealand will probably just put a flight in there anyway. Like if someone proves the path, then surely the big boys will just come in and take it over anyway, because that's now a commercially viable route.
Yeah, so I guess that's the risk. So if you're going to be a new entrant into the market, you need to pick the routes that are not viable for the scale players, right? So you need to find routes that are support an aircraft that's maybe got 10 or 20 or 30 seats, but is never going to support an aircraft that's got 70 or 150 seats. And those routes do exist. So there are routes. There's, airlines out there. Sounds Air, is a really, really good operation, servicing predominantly, the top of the South Island, lower part of the North Island. They do a great job, and there's a place for an airline like that alongside Air New Zealand. And I think they kind of cohabitate quite well together because they're flying routes that would never be big enough to support Air New Zealand aircraft.
Yep, I'm thinking it's Mount Cook Air. I think there's a Mount Cook Air, and I think there's an airline that flies over the Great Barrier as well. Is it Barrier Air or something like that? So so little ones around the place. Hey, I'm interested that obviously with our coronavirus lives we're living in right now, quite near the start, you were involved with the government in, I guess, being a conduit between business and government. Look at the economic, the way to revive economically. That was a position that the government approached you on. Is that correct? Or did you offer your services and they take you up on it?
It's like all these things. It's kind of a bit of both, to be honest. I mean, I'd been quite vocal along with some other, I guess, kind of sideline commentators concerned that the government wasn't moving fast enough to lock the country down in the early days. And if you go back a couple of weeks before lockdown, we were still letting tourists into the country, right? And I was like saying, this is nuts. We're letting people into the country from these areas of the world that have already got quite high numbers of infection. It's just an inevitability that it's going to arrive here and start causing us real issues.
Yeah.
So I was advocating, as were a number of others, and so the Prime Minister offered me an opportunity to, along with a few others, to have a chat with her about our concerns and to share a few insights into what her thinking and plans were. And off the back of that, she identified that there would be value in having someone sitting in central government alongside her team, interfacing with the business community. And she asked me if I would play that role, and that was on the Sunday before we went into then level 3 on the Monday and level 4 on that Wednesday.
Yep.
So I was actually I was in Greymouth at the time having this conversation on the phone. I was down at Pike River. In fact, I just spent earlier that day out at Gloriavale. I was interested to go out and kind of have a look at what that setup was all about, which was fascinating. And I came back. I had this conversation with the Prime Minister. I jumped on a plane, went up to Auckland, packed a bag, and went down to Wellington, and that was me for the next 9 weeks.
So I'm just writing down Gloriavale because we can't just skip over that as quickly as that. We got to come back there, but let's stick with coronavirus for now. And so during the lockdown, were you someone who was in communication with the government? Were you like as a conduit, my word, not yours, between government and business? Yeah. Were you talking about when do we reopen? How do we allow businesses to survive? What we need to do? What role did you play during the lockdown, and what outcomes did you see from your involvement?
Yeah, so my primary role when I was down there was to try and figure out how we could mobilise New Zealand businesses to support the government's effort in response to the virus.
Right.
So it wasn't so much focused on how we get business up and running again. At that point, we'd locked the country down, and one of the issues that businesses were finding is there are a heap of people out there with resources and ideas and capability to support the government, but they had no way in to kind of connect with anyone to figure out how they could add value. So, for example, we had the team at Zuru Toys saying to me, look, they've got 5,000 employees in China on the ground. We were needing to source personal protective equipment for the hospitals and so on. And they were saying, look, we've got people on the ground in China that can go and evaluate factories, they can get product tested and so on. And no one at that point could jump on a plane and fly it there, right? We had everything locked down, and it was locked down at the China end. So they were prepared to go and source all this product for the New Zealand government. Government doesn't really move very fast, right? That's not in government's nature. So I said, well, you'll need to give me an opportunity to go and get some budget signed off. They said, look, we'll just buy it. We'll spend our money. We'll buy it. We'll figure out later on kind of how the government, can reimburse us for the costs of this. And we got a job done in a couple of weeks that probably would have otherwise taken a couple of months. And so it was that type of thing. I was looking to say, government's good at some things, but they can't necessarily move at speed. They're not necessarily good at taking risk and innovating. So, my focus was saying, how can I put government and business together to accelerate some things, to amplify some things, to achieve things that otherwise wouldn't be able to achieve with government just left to its own devices.
Out of interest, when you said we'll just buy it, who's the wheel? Who went out and bought the PPE?
So there are a number of companies I work with, but in that instance, Zuru spent several $1 million of their own money just saying we'll just fund it, we'll just buy it, and we trust basically that I'd figure out with Grant Robertson how at some point they could be reimbursed for that. Stephen Tyndall in the warehouse did the same thing. Stephen Tyndall, in fact, underwrote an order of 50 ICU ventilators because we didn't have enough ICU beds in New Zealand. I think the value of that was $3 or $4 million. He said, look, I'll just underwrite that. Let's get the order in place and we'll figure out downstream, how that gets recompensed. So these guys were putting their own money and, quite frankly, their balls on the line to just say, we'll do what needs to be done and let's worry about the detail later on.
It's probably amazing as well, just purely because we're talking about economies of scale again. I mean, that one individual, Sir Stephen Tyndall, can underwrite, ventilators, which probably was enough to help the country. Whereas you look to a place like America, and obviously it's a much bigger story than just not enough ventilators if you look what's going on there. But because we're small, proportionally, even if we had a bad run, that might have been enough. But gosh, America needs tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of that kind of product, which would be a lot harder to actually physically get your hands on. So it might have been a time where our size really helped us, perhaps.
I think our size and the fact, it helped us in many ways, I think. So I agree with you, we didn't need as much of this stuff. But also because we're a small size, everyone kind of knows each other and can talk to each other and get stuff done. The ability for us to move at speed. I mean, we ordered and got stuff on flights and boats coming here in terms of PPE well before Australia. I was talking to the Australians and I was talking to the Americans. We were ahead of them in the queue. And if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have only been waiting a few weeks. We could have been waiting several months before we got our orders in the queue if we hadn't moved at speed. And I ran I didn't run, but I was involved in a conference call where we got a whole bunch of doctors on the front lines in New York and Europe and so on to talk to the Ministry of Health here, to share with them their experience of what they were seeing, because they clearly had big problems in their countries.
Yeah.
We weren't seeing issues here. So we wanted to see, is there things we could learn from their experience? And this doctor who was on the front lines in New York was saying for the first 3 or 4 weeks in New York, they were being issued one mask a week as doctors, and they were having to take it home each day and wash it in their washing machine and put it on and wear it. Whereas, we were provisioning and we had the capacity for people to have, 8 to 10 masks a day.
Wow.
If they're working in the health system. So that just shows the value and the implication of being able to do some of these things at speed versus the alternative that was plainly evident in places like New York.
It's also really nice to hear business being involved there as well. So often we hear in societal conversation about how business is the thing that drains and uses and abuses people and doesn't pay people enough money. We need a living wage and all that kind of stuff. And I don't necessarily disagree with a lot of that, but what we don't often hear is the opposite side of that conversation. And I believe often, most of us would probably agree that you hear these arguments at the extremities and the truth is normally somewhere in the middle. And that seemed to be a lovely example you just gave of how business got involved and helped the whole country out. And without those businesses with that money, or those individuals like Stephen Tyndall with that money, then they wouldn't have had the opportunity to help the whole country get through this. So it's quite nice to have that at least out there, if nothing else.
Yeah, I agree. And, I felt, I came away from this whole experience thinking, for a whole range of reasons, I'm glad I live here in New Zealand versus some other places in the world. And, I saw many examples of that. There was a Sam Morgan and Stephen Tyndall. So Stephen funded a food initiative to hoover up kind of donated and leftover food, and that's continuing. And ultimately, I helped to facilitate the government putting some money into this initiative as well. But anyway, in April, when people were in lockdown, and a number of people had already lost their jobs by that point of time, this initiative that they funded provided 1.5 million meals, free meals out to people in around New Zealand. And I didn't see the final numbers for May, but I think they did over 2 million meals in May and so on, because all the traditional food banks weren't working when people were locked down, because there was no way for them to get donations and all that kind of stuff. So they were working. This food network was working with iwi and Salvation Army and others to get food out into these communities in need. And there's a lot of really cool stuff being done that, as I say, I felt proud and privileged in some way to be a part of some of those initiatives. In a country like New Zealand, we got a sense that everyone really did embrace this notion of being in this thing together and supporting each other.
You obviously made noises near the start that we took too long to shut down. I've always sort of been of the opinion that with no perfect outcome, we acknowledge that we can never get a perfect outcome. If we have a column of good decisions and a column of bad decisions, I would hope our government takes as many from the good and as few from the bad, and that's about as much as we can hope for. In hindsight now, as to where we are, how do you think the lockdown panned out? How do you think about the open up? There was some people saying that we should have opened up sooner, but what obviously you were on the inside on some level. How would you rate how we've done and how this government's done in particular as to where we're at today and how they got through the rest of lockdown?
For me, I reckon it's a 9 out of 10. You never get it perfect, right?
Yeah.
I think the government did a tremendous job, and you have to remember it's pretty hard actually. We only went into lockdown in late March. It's not that long ago.
Yeah.
But even then, there was so much we didn't know, right? So the Prime Minister and government were having to make these decisions, not really understanding how this virus actually worked, not really knowing at that point what potential death rates could be. There were all sorts of people doing modelling, but they were simulation models that were just guessing at how big the problem could be. So, but and people were saying, well, we locked down. Did we? Australia didn't lock down construction. Did we need to lock down construction? Just didn't know any of these things, right? So I think the government's approach, having the courage and despite my early criticisms, I think having the courage to go when they did, to have the courage to go as hard as they did, has now earned us the right to have one of, if not the freest society in the world today in terms of our domestic society, right? The paradox is that now creates some challenges for us because we have eradicated or eliminated the virus. So, it makes it more difficult for us to open our borders in any way because, if we bring it back into the country, we undo all the hard work and investment we've made.
Yep.
So we are a little bit isolated, but I think the government has done an absolutely tremendous job. And I think they deserve absolute credit for that leadership. I think now we're moving into a new phase and it becomes quite challenging figuring out as a trading nation how we can get our international economy and people moving again without creating any risk of bringing the virus back across the border. And that's a difficult challenge to solve, but I think we should be putting as much of our private sector and government intellect against solving that problem as we can.
I think it's a really interesting thing you say, and I think that we are almost standalone at the moment about how we are in the world. And just if people haven't heard yet, and I can do this I think with Zoom, or I can show you something, that just today, literally just today, coronavirus, Vietnam on high alert after first COVID cases in months. So Vietnam, which was one of those places that's also been held up as a shining light, I think they've had 15 cases of community transmission today, and they're basically going back into lockdown literally just today. So your comment about it getting back across the border, I think is true. It also makes me think it's kind of ironic actually, because as you were talking about the airlines going into debt, I kind of think, well, that, and I think you used the phrase "to get through this." That sounds like that's the logical conclusion for us as well as a country. Like I'm someone, and I'm not put myself up as any kind of expert in the world of business or the world of tax and how that works, but I'd be more than happy for the next decade to pay a teeny bit more in tax, whatever it is, $1 per $100 or whatever, to help support what we have to borrow to go through right now, to keep us in this place where we're unique in the world at the moment. Maybe literally when you see places like Vietnam having to shut back down again.
Yeah.
That's just my perspective though.
Yeah, no, I agree with that perspective to a point. The one thing I would say is even if we change nothing from what we're doing today, there's still a risk that this virus is going to get back into New Zealand. We've got aircrew that are flying and come home and, not required to self-isolate, that are going out into the community. We have, there's the data now suggests as many as 50% of people that get this virus are asymptomatic. They never show symptoms, but they're still able to transmit it to other people. So I think under any scenario, we have to at least plan for a possibility that we'll get the virus back into the country. And we need to be doing everything we can to make sure if that happens, we don't have to lock the country down again. And that means we need really good testing. And, we seem to be having this real battle to be testing enough people at the moment. We need a really good contact tracing system in place, and we seem to be having a battle to accept we need a much bigger ambition in terms of contact tracing. So we should be investing, to your point, I'd like to be investing some of that $1 extra in tax or whatever it may be to make sure we're building better defences for what I think is potentially an inevitable reoccurrence of the virus at some point in time in New Zealand.
I guess we all hope. I mean, my father was in the 1948 polio epidemic. He still has polio to this day. Well, the effects of it, I should say. And so I guess most of us, the world over, are just waiting for that vaccine and hoping it will come. But what I hear you, when you talk, it makes me think, I don't necessarily hear you saying this, but when you talk, it makes me think, what if that never happens? What if there is never that? Or what if this is like, and I don't mean like the flu, like the symptoms, I don't need any tweets about that. But I mean like the flu, like next year there's a COVID-20, then the year after that there's a COVID-21. And so there's a cyclical nature to this. Then what?
So when I'm talking to businesses, I'm telling them, based on everything I've read, I'm planning on the assumption that this is with us for 3 years.
Wow.
So it could be longer, it could be shorter, but I'm planning for 3 years. The idea of a vaccine in 12 to 18 months that's going to enable us to vaccinate a few billion people in the world is highly, highly improbable. Excuse me a moment.
Is Jacinda giving you a call saying, "Oh, yeah, well, you're there"?
I think it's highly improbable. I think it's more realistic that it's 2.5 to 3 years, and that is, and then there's, as you say, there's no guarantee. So I think we have to plan for living with this for the foreseeable future. And we shouldn't be thinking of this like a earthquake or a tidal wave or, a terrorist event. This is not an event that comes and goes. This is something that's going to be enduring.
Do you have any opinions outside the box, looking conspiracy theory type stuff now, as to whether it was a laboratory release thing or an act of nature, out of interest?
I don't have a theory, and I mean, sadly, in this day and age, I don't think we'll actually ever know. So, there's so much in the media, we just don't know what's kind of real versus what's fiction. The Americans will say one thing, the Chinese will say something else. Who's telling the truth? You could see the bat being infected with a virus by a human, and you don't know if that's a make-believe image or a real image. So I just don't even invest any emotional energy or time in trying to understand those issues because I don't know who to trust as a source of the information, right?
Hey, are you someone who's interested in getting involved in politics? You seem to, obviously, you've had some thoughts and you've got some experiences. Is that something that interests you? Could you imagine getting involved in the push and shove of Parliament?
No.
Not at all?
Never. Not at all. I mean, for me, I tell you, like I'm in a business sense, my style is very inclusive. I like being out amongst people. I'm very consultative, but ultimately as a business leader, you get to make decisions and you're held accountable for those decisions. I think the process of government and consultation and democracy and so on would. I don't think I've got the patience for it, to be honest. I just like to get on and get things, get stuff done.
And maybe it sounds like with your experience, of what you've just gone through, being involved in, I was going to say consultancy, but talking to the government about how to do things, you've actually impacted the country in a way maybe more effectively and better than any politician could anyway.
Well, it's all about collaboration, right? And I think, my business experience and expertise allows me to bring something to the table that's just a different skill set. And I'm all about collaboration and just recognising strengths. I've got tremendous respect for the Prime Minister. In fact, I've thoroughly enjoyed working with her through this process, and we continue to have ongoing dialogue around how the recovery process will pan out. And I enjoy being able to provide a perspective and input and provide networks and points of connection for her without necessarily kind of being inside the tent and caught up in the day-to-day kind of machinations of that political world.
As someone who's sort of a respected figure in the business world and New Zealand society in general, even though you don't want to get involved in politics, are you the kind of person that makes your views know about who you're endorsing? Do you endorse a Prime Minister as one of the two leaders at the moment, the person you'd prefer to see as Prime Minister for the next stage?
I haven't at any point publicly endorsed any Prime Minister. My view and my approach has always been the more effective a government is, when they're in power, the better it is for the country. You want governments that get stuff done. We're in an incredibly fortunate position here in New Zealand, in my view, where whether you're supportive of a Labour-led government or a National-led government, the difference is kind of plus or minus 10% either side.
For sure.
We don't have the radical polarisation you see in say, the US, or you're seeing in other parts of the world. So my approach has always been to do everything I can to help the sitting government to be as effective as possible. And if I look back, since I've been, if we go back to my Air New Zealand days, working with firstly Helen Clark, then John Key, for a short period, Bill English, and now with Jacinda Ardern. I've had really, really successful and effective working relationships with all of those prime ministers. In fact, if people would be surprised if I look back to my time at Air New Zealand, I actually think the Helen Clark-led Labour government was probably a far more effective supporter of Air New Zealand and what we were trying to achieve than the John Key-led national government was. And that had nothing to do with John's individual politics. It was just the nature of who the ministers were in the key roles and what it was the airline was trying to achieve at that point in time. But the Helen Clark government's decision to bail out the airline at the time they did, to the tune of $800 million, and set that up for a rebirth as a new airline, and allow the sort of restructuring to take place that needed to take place, was incredibly courageous leadership from a Labour government at the time. And I think New Zealand has benefited enormously as a consequence.
Well, hey, look, we'll let you go in a tick if that's okay, but I cannot move away, cannot say goodbye to you and thank you for your time until you tell us about Gloriavale, because Gloriavale for me is one of those places in New Zealand that I would love to rock up to with a camera and spend a weekend talking to people and interviewing them and finding out more about them. So please, please, please tell me your experiences of Gloriavale.
Yes, so I spent half a day out at Gloriavale, and to be fair, I didn't really get a chance. It was a few days before lockdown, so I was very conscious of the risk of what is a tight community of
Sure.
that they would be very health conscious. So my My focus was really, I was keen to go out there and understand a little about their business operations and their business interests.
All right.
So that was the substance of my engagement. And to be frank, looking through that lens, I was incredibly impressed with what those guys do. They create a whole bunch of consumer products. They've got a big honey operation. They've got a big operation in healthy confectionery products based on milk products.
All right.
Which they sell, throughout New Zealand and the likes. And they are very, very smart business people. As I say, I didn't get insights into the culture or the community itself.
Gotcha.
And how it operates, but a lot of people I've talked to on the West Coast that interact with the community only had really positive things to say about their engagement, the business ethics, and so on of the people that they deal with out there. And so I just wanted to at least get a little bit of a glimpse for myself. And as I say, from a business perspective, I was very impressed with their acumen.
And so does that mean you're kind of move away from the icebreaker label and you're going to go on the board of Gloria Vale milk products or something? Is that the next step for the Rob Fyfe kind of business empire?
I don't think you'll see me on a Gloria Vale board. But having said that, my stage in life, right? I'm 59 now. A lot of my energy and time is helping young entrepreneurs, people that are trying to figure out how to make their business and or their passions more effective and more successful. So I do a lot of mentoring and advisory stuff, not for payment, just because I like to help people kind of achieve the most they can in the context of whatever their passions are.
Hey Rob, thanks for chatting to us today. This has been a blast.
Cool. Well, as you forewarned me at the outset, you never know what path these conversations will take. But
no, I tell you, okay, if someone had said to me, I bet you $1,000 Gloria Vale will come up during your podcast today, I would have taken that bet in a heartbeat. So it's very exciting. Yeah. What's the next kind of 6 months for you? What are we looking out for you? Where are we going to see Rob Fyfe? What's going on?
Yeah, well, hopefully I'll continue to have the opportunity to work alongside government to help us chart and navigate and plan what our recovery and rebuild from this pandemic looks like. When I left Air New Zealand, I got offered a number of airline CEO jobs around the world. I figured out, I'm not especially good at airlines. I think what I am good at and what I'm passionate about is figuring out how to take the things New Zealand is really good at and figuring out how to leverage that on the world stage. And Air New Zealand was an example of that. Icebreaker was an example of that. I just love finding ways to help New Zealand be more successful and ensure we get to continue to enjoy this amazing quality of life we have in our little corner of the world.
We might have to come and have a chat with you about how you help us make this podcast the biggest thing in the world at some stage. Hey, before we go, two questions. The first question is just a yes or no, and then a potential answer, and then an opinion-based question. You said you never endorse sort of a prime minister or anything. Would you like to do it for the first time here and now? And the second thing is, do you think that it would be helpful, harmful, or it wouldn't matter to change government in the middle of this pandemic recovery?
So to the first question, no, I'm not going to change that position.
Okay, fair enough.
However, I would say I think Jacinda Ardern has done an outstanding leadership job through this crisis. I actually, it's very rare. I think people often vote for a change of government rather than vote for supporting a government. So people say people vote governments out rather than vote governments in.
Yep.
I always start from a position that continuity of government is a good thing to get things done. I think our electoral term of 3 years is so friggin' short, it's ridiculous. So I think continuity of government through a pandemic like this just putting New Zealand politics aside in general would be a good thing rather than a bad thing.
We should probably leave that alone, because then we can start talking about so they should keep Trump in, and that might be a different conversation altogether, because that would be a continuity as well. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess the balance is, I think not just within New Zealand, but the world looks at us and seeing that we've navigated this to date very effectively. I don't think they look at the US in the same vein.
Hey, Rob Fyfe, thank you for giving us some time this morning. Really appreciate it, and have a splendid day.
Cool. Thanks, Pat.